Chapter 17 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. 17. 1810 to 1811. Marie-Louise. Marie-Louise, Archduchess of Austria, was born at Vienna the 12th of December, 1791. She was the eldest child of the Archduke Francis, who, a year after her birth, upon the death of his father Leopold II, became Emperor of Germany under the name of Francis II. Leopold was the son of the great Empress Maria Theresa, and was the brother of Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, and of Marie Caroline, Queen of Naples. Marie Thérèse, the eldest daughter of the Queen of Naples, married her first cousin Francis, so Marie-Louise was the great-granddaughter of Maria Theresa on both her father's and her mother's side. A sister of Marie Thérèse married Louis Philippe, afterwards King of the French, and was the grandmother of the Comte de Paris; and her brother Francis married his cousin Marie Clémentine, daughter of Leopold II, and their daughter became the wife of the Duc de Berry, son of Charles X of France, and was the mother of Comte de Chambord. It thus appears, curious as it may seem, that the son of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, the Duke of Reichstadt, chief of the imperial dynasty, the Comte de Chambord, head of the elder branch of the Bourbons, and the Comte de Paris, representative of the younger branch of the same family, were all three descendants in direct line from Maria Theresa, Empress of Germany, and her daughter Marie Caroline, Queen of Naples. What philosophical reflections come to the mind when one thinks of the fate of these three cousins, all born heirs to the throne of France, whose birth was announced by the booming of the cannon of the Invalides, but none of whom was destined to wear a crown. As previously stated, the divorce of Josephine was first officially discussed at the Erfurt meeting in September, 1807. At that time, Napoleon directed Talleyrand and Caulaincourt to sound Alexander regarding an alliance with one of his sisters. The response was equally vague and discreet. But a week after his return home his sister Catherine was affianced to the heir of the Duchy of Oldenburg. There could be no doubts in Napoleon's mind as to the significance of this event. During the 2 following years, although Napoleon had not by any means abandoned the idea of repudiating Josephine, the matter remained in abeyance. For a long time past there had existed in France a very general desire that the Emperor should assure the stability of the throne by contracting a new marriage and acquiring a direct heir to his dynasty. To this wish Napoleon was now ready to accede. Neither before nor after the conclusion of the Peace of Vienna had there been a word exchanged with the Austrian cabinet upon the subject of a matrimonial alliance. Napoleon's thoughts still turned to the Grand Duchess Anne, the other sister of the Czar. On the 22nd of November, 1809, a week before the formal notification to Josephine of his intentions, the Emperor instructed Champagny, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, to send a dispatch to Caulaincourt, the French ambassador at St. Petersburg, directing him to ask the Czar to state frankly whether "he could count upon his sister." At that time it took 2 weeks for a courier to go from Paris to St. Petersburg, and Napoleon had received no reply to his demand, when on the last day of November he informed Josephine that the divorce was irrevocably decided. A month later no answer had yet come from Russia, and in the meantime no steps had been taken towards opening matrimonial negotiations with Austria. It is a very remarkable fact that it was Josephine who took the initiative. On the 2nd of January, 1810, she asked the Comtesse de Metternich to come and see her at Malmaison. Before the campaign of Wagram, Metternich, who was then a count, as his father Prince de Metternich was still living, had been the Austrian ambassador at Paris, where he had had much success both as a diplomat and as a man of the world. On the declaration of war he had been recalled to Vienna, but had left his wife in Paris. Since the peace he had been made Minister of Foreign Affairs in place of the bellicose Stadion. To Madame de Metternich, Josephine said, "I have a plan for the Emperor to marry your Archduchess. I spoke to him about it yesterday, and he replied that his choice had not yet been definitely made. But I think that it would be, if he were certain to be accepted by you." Madame de Metternich, very much surprised at this overture, hastened to send the news to her husband in a letter written the following day. The Russian reply was still awaited, and no official communications had been addressed to Austria when the Emperor, after Mass on Sunday, the 21st of January, 1810, called a meeting of the principal dignitaries of the Empire to discuss the respective advantages and disadvantages of a matrimonial alliance with Russia, Austria, or Saxony. The Arch Chancellor, Cambacérès, and King Murat declared for the Grand Duchess Anne; Prince Eugène, Talleyrand, Champagny, Berthier, and Marais for the Archduchess Marie Louise, while Lebrun favored the daughter of the King of Saxony. Napoleon at the end of the conference gave no indication of his own preference. By a curious coincidence this discussion took place 17 years to a day after the execution of Louis XVI, the husband of the great aunt of Marie Louise. It is a striking instance of the shortness of human foresight that this Austrian marriage, which was so warmly advocated by the ablest of Napoleon's councillors as destined to assure the safety of the Empire, was to be the cause of its fall. If he had not blindly counted upon the friendship of his father in law, Napoleon would certainly never have undertaken the disastrous Russian campaign. As he afterwards said himself, his marriage with the Archduchess was only an abyss covered with flowers. On the 6th of February a despatch was received from Caulaincourt, in which he stated that he had not yet obtained a definite answer from the Czar. He added that the Grand Duchess, who was only 15, was not yet of an age to marry, and furthermore that she was not willing to change her religion. Napoleon hesitated no longer. He immediately broke off negotiations with Russia, and the same evening inquired of the Austrian ambassador, Prince de Schwarzenberg, whether the marriage contract with the Archduchess Marie Louise could be signed the next day. The ambassador was placed in a very embarrassing position. He knew that his court was favorably disposed, but no one had thought events would move so rapidly, and he had no definite instructions. Knowing the impatience of Napoleon, who never wished to be kept waiting, he assumed the responsibility, and replied without hesitation that he was ready, and made an appointment with Champagny to sign on the following day at the Tuileries the contract for the marriage of the Emperor of the French, King of Italy, with the Archduchess of Austria, Marie Louise. The contract, which was duly signed, as arranged, was an almost exact copy of the marriage contract of Marie Antoinette signed 40 years before. At the court of the Tuileries the satisfaction was universal. The courier despatched by the Austrian ambassador brought the news to Vienna a week later. There the feeling was one of surprise rather than of pleasure. But no objections were raised in any quarter. The formal announcement was made in the Government Gazette under date of the 24th of February. The marriage was celebrated with great pomp on the 11th of March in the church of the Augustins, the Archduke Charles representing the Emperor Napoleon. 2 days later the new Empress started on her journey to Paris. At the Bavarian frontier she was received by the ladies of her future household, who were to serve as her escort during the remainder of her journey. On the 23rd of March Marie Louise crossed the Rhine and arrived at Strasbourg on French soil. The Emperor had already been for 3 days at Compiègne, where he awaited with impatience the arrival of his new wife. The château had been repaired and sumptuously refurnished, and the members of the imperial family had arrived. The formal meeting between the Emperor and Marie Louise was to have taken place with much ceremony at a point between Soissons and Compiègne, but Napoleon could not restrain his impatience. All at once he decided to abandon the etiquette arranged for the following day and rush to meet her. With Murat as his only companion he entered a modest calèche without armorial bearings, conducted by a servant without livery, and set out. It was raining in torrents when they arrived at Courcelles, where the Empress would stop to change horses. They descended from the carriage and took refuge from the rain under the porch of a church opposite the relay station. No one in the village imagined that these two unknown travelers were the Emperor of the French and the King of Naples. As soon as the carriage of the Empress arrived, Napoleon rushed to the door, and, entering precipitately, embraced his wife. The carriage then continued its course with the Emperor and Murat and their wives. At 10 o'clock they reached Compiègne. At the château the members of the court were awaiting them at the foot of the staircase. Napoleon presented them to the Empress, and then conducted her to her own apartment, where they had supper together. According to the etiquette arranged in advance, the Emperor was to have passed the night at the Hotel of the Chancellerie, but this programme went the way of that of the first meeting, and Napoleon followed the example of Henri IV. with Marie de Medici. Marie Louise, writes Meneval, was then in all the bloom of youth. Her form was perfect, her light chestnut hair, fine and abundant, framed a visage which was fresh and full, to which her soft eyes gave a charming expression. Her lips, which were somewhat large, recalled the type of the reigning family of Austria, as the slightly aquiline shape of her nose made one think of the House of Bourbon. The court left Compiègne the last day of March, and arrived at St. Cloud the same evening. Here the civil marriage was celebrated the following day, in the presence of nearly all the members of the imperial family. On Monday, the 2nd of April, Napoleon and Marie Louise went to Paris for the religious ceremony. They used the magnificent coronation carriage, and were escorted by the cavalry of the Imperial Guard. The beautiful avenue of the Champs Elysées was lined with troops who kept back the crowds of enthusiastic spectators. They entered the Tuileries by way of the gardens, and ascended the grand stairway to the first floor. From there they passed by the Pavillon de Flore, through the grand galleries of the Louvre to the Salon Carré, which had been transformed into a chapel for the religious ceremony. Napoleon was very happy in his marriage, and was very devoted to his young wife. At this time he was not yet 41 years of age. He had become much handsomer in his maturity than during his youth. He was much less brusque in his manners, and was far more amiable. He had become familiar with court rules and etiquette, and played his role of sovereign with all the talent and ease of a born actor. From being taciturn he had become a brilliant talker, with a command of language which surprised every one. When he wished to please, there was a charm in his smile which no one could resist. He endeavored not only to please but to fascinate his young wife. He was not only happy but also proud to be allied with so old and so distinguished a family, and this feeling of satisfied pride gave him an evenness of temper, a serenity, a gaiety, which delighted his courtiers. From St. Cloud the sovereigns went on the 5th of April to Compiègne, whence they departed at the end of the month for a triumphal tour through the northern departments. Their trip was a long ovation. They were accompanied by Jérôme and his wife, Caroline, Eugène, Schwarzenberg, and Metternich. During the course of their journey the Emperor and Empress spent several days at the Château of Laeken, near Brussels, and the Marquise de la Tour du Pin, whose husband was then prefect of that city, has given us in her Recollections an interesting account of this visit. She found Marie Louise stupid and insignificant to the last degree, absolutely lacking in tact and savoir faire. On the contrary, she was charmed with the Emperor, of whom she always speaks in the highest terms. On the 1st of June they were back at St. Cloud, where they passed the summer. The life of Napoleon at this time was one continual ovation. Never had Louis XIV, the Roi Soleil, been so flattered in prose or in verse. Even his military adversaries had become his admirers. The most illustrious of them all, the Archduke Charles, wrote him in terms of the greatest admiration, in acknowledging the grand cordon of the Légion d'Honneur which the Emperor had sent him, accompanied by a simple cross of chevalier, of even greater value because he had worn it himself. During the month of June numerous fêtes were given in honor of the Emperor and Empress. That of the 10th of June, given by the city of Paris, was particularly brilliant. On the 14th a magnificent ball was given by the Princess Pauline at her château of Neuilly. But the most beautiful, the most original, and the most imposing of all, was that of the Imperial Guard in the Champ de Mars. The last of these grand entertainments was to be the ball of the Austrian ambassador, Prince de Schwarzenberg, on the 1st of July at his hotel in the Rue de la Chaussée-d'Antin. This was the former residence of the Marquise de Montesson, the widow of the old Duc d'Orléans, to whom this lady had been united by a morganatic marriage. As the rez-de-chaussée of the hotel was too small to accommodate all of the guests, a large temporary ballroom had been built of wood. The Emperor and Empress, and all of the haute société of Paris were present. A little after midnight, when the ball was at its height, the flimsy decorations of the ballroom caught fire from a flickering candle, and the flames spread with terrible rapidity. The Emperor, who remained as calm as on the field of battle, urged all the guests to retain their presence of mind, and quietly escorted the Empress out by way of the gardens. But unfortunately many lost their heads, and in the panic which ensued there were a number of victims to the flames, including the wife of the ambassador. Napoleon, after accompanying Marie Louise as far as the Place de la Concorde, returned to the hotel, while the Empress went on to St. Cloud. The Emperor remained at the hotel supervising the work there, exposed to a torrent of rain, until 3 o'clock in the morning. This catastrophe produced a profound impression of sadness throughout the city. Many persons recalled the calamity which had overshadowed the fête at the time of the marriage of Marie Antoinette 40 years before, and saw in it an omen of ill fortune. Marie Louise was also very happy in her married life. The Empress wrote her father at this time: "I assure you, dear papa, that the Emperor has been much calumniated. The more you see him de près, the more you appreciate and love him." The satisfaction of Napoleon was even greater when he learned that his young wife was enceinte. His joy had no bounds, and he was, if possible, even more attentive than before. The official statement of the coming event was not made until late in November. The child, so earnestly desired, was born at 9 o'clock on the morning of the 20th of March, 1811. An enormous crowd awaited in the gardens of the Tuileries the news of the birth, which would be announced by the thunder of the cannon of the Invalides. If the child was a girl, only 21 shots would be fired; if a boy, 101. Suddenly the cannon began to boom. All the windows in the city are open; the carriages stop in the streets, and the pedestrians halt on the sidewalks. Every one counts the reports. At the 22nd there is an explosion of joy. Every one knows that the Emperor has a son. At last there is an heir to the throne of France. It was the happiest day in the life of Napoleon. His eyes were filled with tears of joy. The decree annexing the Papal States had made the Eternal City the second city in the Empire. In imitation of the ancient custom by which the prince destined to succeed to the German Caesar was called the King of the Romans, Napoleon had decided that his son should be given the title of King of Rome. The day of his birth the little King of Rome was privately baptized at 9 o'clock in the evening in the chapel of the Tuileries. All of the imperial family and the principal dignitaries of the state were present. The Marquise de la Tour du Pin has given in her Recollections a vivid description of the scene. "We had had to enter by the Pavillon de Flore and pass through all the apartments as far as the Salle des Maréchaux. The salons were full of the dignitaries of the Empire, men and women. Every one endeavored to be at the edge of the passage way, kept open by the ushers, where the procession was to pass to descend to the chapel. We managed to manoeuvre so as to find ourselves on the landing of the stairway. From this point we enjoyed a very rare sight, that of the old grognards of the Vieille Garde, arranged in order upon each step, every one wearing the cross upon his breast. They were forbidden to make a movement, but a very vivid emotion was depicted upon their stern faces, and I saw tears of joy in their eyes. The Emperor appeared at the side of Madame de Montesquieu, who bore the child, with his face uncovered, upon a cushion of white satin covered with lace. I had the opportunity to obtain a good look at him." On the 22nd of March, when the Emperor received in the throne room of the Tuileries the great dignitaries of the state, the President of the Senate said: "Your people salute with unanimous acclamations this new star which has arisen upon the horizon of France, whose first ray dissipates even the last shadows of the darkness of the future." What sympathetic heart can avoid a feeling of sadness at the thought of how this "new star" was so soon to disappear below the horizon; of how this little King of Rome was to be deprived not only of his royal title, but even of his name of Napoleon Bonaparte; that he was destined to be called only Francis, Duke of Reichstadt, and to be laid to his eternal rest in the Church of the Capuchins at Vienna, in an Austrian uniform. Shortly after his return from Wagram, Napoleon made the remark: "En voilà assez du métier de soldat, le temps est arrivé de faire celui du roi." During the years 1810 and 1811 it was generally believed that France had seen the end of wars for the rest of his reign. The victor in so many campaigns seemed to be ambitious only for the glories of peace. On the 19th of September the Emperor left Compiègne for an extended tour to Belgium, Holland, and the banks of the Rhine. 3 days later the Empress, with her court, set out for the Château of Laeken, near Brussels. The Emperor was to rejoin her the last of the month at Antwerp, after a visit to the ports on the Channel. On the 9th of October the sovereigns entered Amsterdam in state. Here the court remained for 2 weeks. The company of the Théâtre Français had been summoned from Paris, and Talma appeared in his best rôles. The people of Holland had been much dissatisfied since the abdication of King Louis the previous year, which had been followed by a rigid enforcement of the continental system. The Low Countries had been annexed to the Empire, and Lebrun was the Governor General. The more the Hollanders were discontented, the more the Emperor was determined to win their regard. He gave his entire time to the study of their wants and wishes with the idea of improving their condition. The 1st of November they left for Cologne, whence they returned by way of Liège to Compiègne, and were back at St. Cloud the last of November, after a trip of nearly 3 months, the longest which the Emperor ever made to the French provinces. At the beginning of the year 1812, Napoleon was at the height of his glory. To the democratic period of the earlier days of the Empire had succeeded an aristocratic regime. The words République Française had disappeared from the coins, which now bore the legend Empire Français. The Emperor posed as the new Charlemagne, the chief of a family of sovereigns. The kings of Bavaria, Würtemberg, Saxony, Westphalia, Naples, and Spain owed to him their royal crowns. The reigning princes of the Confederation of the Rhine were his subservient vassals. No monarch in history has ever held sway over so many lands and so many peoples. From the Baltic to the Strait of Gibraltar, from the Channel to the Adriatic, his will was law. The grand dignitaries and marshals of the Empire concealed their plebeian names under the titles of dukes and princes, even of kings. Lefebvre, a miller's son, was Duc de Danzig; Augereau, the son of a mason, was Duc de Castiglione; Ney, a cooper's son, was Duc d'Ellingen; Masséna, the son of a publican, was Prince d'Essling; Berthier, whose father was a steward at Versailles, was the sovereign Prince de Neufchâtel, and married to a Bavarian princess; and Murat, the son of an innkeeper, was King of Naples. All of the marshals were provided with magnificent dotations to sustain their titles. Berthier possessed an income of over 1,000,000 francs, without counting the revenues from his principality. Masséna had an income of 800,000, in addition to his salary of 200,000 as marshal, and so with the others. The Emperor also gave them fine hotels in the city and magnificent estates in the country. In addition to the titles of prince or duke, which commemorated decisive battles, like Rivoli, Montebello, Essling, and Wagram, other duchés, granting no territorial authority, but provided with an annual dotation of 60,000 francs, were given to marshals and generals. In order to bind his companions in arms more firmly to his throne and dynasty, Napoleon married them to the richest heiresses in France. Other officers of lower rank received the title of Comte or Baron, with smaller dotations. For example, La Salle had 50,000 francs, Junot 80, Rapp and Savary each over 100,000 francs. In addition to these magnificent incomes, the Emperor distributed other rewards. After his return from Tilsit in 1807, he divided 11,000,000 francs among his marshals and generals of division. Every officer was to receive from 1 to 3,000 Napoleons, with which to amuse himself during a few days in Paris. Promotions, titles, and wealth were the allurements held out before every one in the army. To these substantial rewards of position and money, as a means of recompensing his army, Napoleon added others in which imagination played a leading part. Chief among these was the Légion d'honneur, which even to day is the most highly esteemed decoration in the world. The order was divided into 5 classes: Chevalier, Officier, Commandeur, Grands Officiers, and Grand Croix. Ranks in the Légion were high honors which were not distributed indiscriminately. Bulletins, orders of the day, words of praise, a more affectionate manner or smile, one of those charming smiles which won the hearts of generals as much as those of simple grenadiers, were still other means adopted by Napoleon to give his army a final increase of energy, incentive, and dash. The impulsion thus given was at first irresistible. But the time came when the marshals and generals wanted to enjoy their honors and their wealth at home in peace, and no longer cared for the danger and fatigue of campaigns from which they had little further to gain. Then this appeal to selfish interest reacted upon himself, and had not a little to do with his final downfall. But what consummate art he showed in handling and influencing men and in forming them into the finest army in the world! Although Napoleon never clearly expressed his opinion regarding the value of his marshals, he certainly established differences among them, and graded them with regard to intelligence, character, and ability for independent command. This is clearly shown in the tasks allotted to the different marshals and the number of divisions assigned to their command. Masséna, Soult, and Davout were the only ones he considered competent for chief command. Ney, the bravest of the brave, and Murat, the beau sabreur, were essentially fighters. Lannes was an excellent corps commander. He was superior to all the generals of the French army on the field of battle when it was a question of manoeuvring 25,000 infantrymen. Of all the generals of the Revolution, Hoche, Desaix, and Kléber were the only ones he thought might have gone far. He had a very poor opinion of Moreau. Napoleon always seems to have preferred officers of brilliancy and dash, like Ney and Murat, to men of more solid and methodical characters, like Davout and St. Cyr. To the Emperor, Davout's brilliant victory at Auerstadt was a revelation, and his splendid work at Eylau and Wagram could but magnify his worth. The Emperor was also slow to appreciate the firmness of character, joined to great intelligence, which distinguished Gouvion St. Cyr, who did not receive his bâton until 1812. Marbeau, who was under his orders during the Russian campaign, says: "He was one of the most capable military men in Europe. I have never known any one who directed his troops better on the field of battle. It was impossible to find a calmer man." Yet, chiefly owing to political reasons, he was always given a secondary place by the Emperor. But Napoleon's great victories were not due entirely to the brilliancy of his strategy and tactics, and the ability of his marshals and generals. Much credit must also be given to his soldiers, who were the best in Europe. Coming from the most martial nation on earth, they were formed by the Emperor into the greatest fighting machine the world has ever known. Napoleon had the power of animating the common soldier and filling him with enthusiasm. He was in the highest degree an inciter of energy. "He spared no pains," says Madame de Rémusat, "to encourage and satisfy his soldiers. All the material and moral means at his disposal were employed with this object in view. Probably no leader of an army," says Vacher, "gave more orders than Napoleon to assure the upkeep and subsistence of his armies." While the tendency in modern armies is to make everything uniform, the Emperor created picked corps among his troops in order to further stimulate the feeling of emulation. The best known of these favored organizations were the Guards. The Old Guard, whom the men called the Immortals, because they were rarely sent into action, were better paid, better fed, and better clothed than the common soldiers. The Young Guard also received high pay, and shared the renown of its elder. All the regiments were jealous of this sacred body of troops, which, in addition to their material advantages and fascinating renown, had the honor of daily watching over the security of the Emperor, and of being his supreme resource in battle. "His soldiers," says Meneval, "never ceased to become enthusiastic about him, to come under his charm, and to obey his will." Although he was finally abandoned by many of his marshals, whom he had loaded with favors, the common soldiers remained faithful to the end, and loved him when he was no longer there. In his Mémoires, Meneval thus explains the secret of Napoleon's mysterious power: "The study of the human heart had taught him the art of attaching men to him and subjugating them. His presence and words aroused enthusiasm. His eloquence was earnest and rapid. His words were energetic, profound, and often sublime. His simple exterior, heightened by an air of grandeur and the habit of command, and the fascination of his look, inspired respect mingled with fear and affection. No leader in history was more popular, and yet never would he consent to humble himself to acquire that popularity." Although he might hold himself aloof in his grandeur from the marshals, the relations between the Emperor and the humble companions who shared his glory were always familiar and cordial. He was like a father with his children. To them he never ceased to be le petit caporal. CHAPTER XVIII.